And I call the member for Denison.
Speaker, I present the Banking Amendment establishing an effective Code of Conduct Bill 2017 and the explanatory memorandum.
The Clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to amend the Banking Act 1959 and for related purposes.
The member for Denison.
Thank you, Speaker. Good morning.
Good
Speaker,
morning.
at the moment there exists only a voluntary code of banking practice. That code is developed entirely by the Australian Bankers Association, a body run by and funded by 25 banks, and the latest version is some 4 years old. While 18 banks, including the Big Four banks, have signed up to this voluntary code, it is indeed voluntary, and 5% of the retail banking market in Australia is not even covered by it. Now, Speaker, at face value, the current code looks pretty good because it includes provisions on the disclosure of fees, charges and other terms and conditions and changes to these terms, on privacy and confidentiality, statements, chargebacks on credit cards, financial hardship, debt collection and complaints handling. And there's a mechanism then for investigating complaints in the Code Compliance Monitoring Committee, or the CCMC. But, Speaker, frankly, the CCMC is ineffective because it is established, run and funded by the industry. Moreover, the CCMC is not an effective method of dealing with complaints from customers directly, because what it can actually investigate or do is very narrow. Indeed, instead of complaints from customers, the CCMC deals mainly with self-reported breaches of the code from the banks. Now, Speaker, customers can take general complaints about banks to the Financial Ombudsman Service, which also covers insurance companies and other financial services. But again, the Financial Ombudsman Service is run and funded by the industry. In 2015, the Ombudsman did receive more than 34,000 complaints, which was an increase of 7%, and it does have the power to refer cases of serious misconduct to ASIC. But in 2015-16, out of more than 34,000 complaints, it only referred, and wait for it, Speaker, five to ASIC. Now, Speaker, what about the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, you might ask? But APRA, which is the bank regulator, simply does not deal with individual complaints. So in short, Speaker, for customers with complaints about banks, there is simply no complaint mechanism that is not run by the industry, and people must resort to private legal action, which of course is an impossible proposition for most members of the community. Speaker, this bill today would fix all of that because it would make the current Code of Banking Practice a legal instrument, and it would empower APRA to deal with complaints that banks have breached the code and to issue penalties where appropriate. The bill, in fact, requires APRA to name and shame banks that breach the code, and it also requires the minister to update the code every 3 years and to consult the bank's customers, both individuals and small businesses, when doing so. So, in essence, Speaker, if I could summarise all that, this bill would turn self-regulation into government regulation and would turn voluntary into mandatory. And finally, it would give banking customers some rights when dealing with their financial institution. Now, Speaker, this is in fact the second time I've sought to do this. I tried during the previous Labor government back in September 2012. And, Speaker, it is telling that when I tried to move an identical bill 5 years ago, neither the Labor government nor the Liberal National opposition expressed any interest in it or any support for it. In fact, the Selection Committee refused to bring it on for a detailed debate and a vote, which just simply went to show, when I tried it last time, Speaker, that neither major party had any interest then in serious banking reform. This is despite the fact, Speaker, that serious reform is needed. I mean, you've only got to pick up any newspaper any day or turn on the news any night, and it seems there's another story about bank misconduct. There can be no doubt that some of the banks are behaving dreadfully a lot of the time, and it is our role in this place to do something about it. Indeed, in my 6.5 years in Parliament, Speaker, and I think I can speak for my crossbench colleagues, in all of our times in the Parliament, we have received numerous complaints from individuals about the way they are being treated by the banks and the inability they are experiencing to do anything about it. Most people don't have pockets deep enough to take on the banks, so we are left powerless, and we on the crossbench, I'm sure, have come across many people in that situation. And not just individuals, Speaker. There is one business group in this country that is being right royally screwed by the banks right now, and that's small business. Because small businesses, like individuals, just simply don't have the power in that relationship to deal with problems and deal with being treated poorly by the banks. A small business can't afford to go to court and take on Westpac or NAB or CommBank or ANZ, because, for a start, they have limited financial resources, and also because the banks will throw everything at it to make sure they don't lose in court. And I must say that my activism on this issue, Mr. Speaker, has been informed and really energised by my dealings with the Tasmanian Small Business Council. And I'd like to acknowledge the President, Jeff Fader, and the Executive Officer, Robert Mallett, for the assistance they've given me in understanding this issue and understanding how small businesses are suffering just as much as individual customers when it comes to misconduct from the banks. And, Speaker, more than ever, we need to do something about this. You know, the behaviour from the banks right now is appalling. In the last year, Speaker, the banks have posted profits of some $30,000 million. Bank profits in this country right now, Speaker, are at about 2.9% of GDP. That's almost an unfathomable thing to get our mind around. The profits of the big four banks is almost 3% of our country's entire gross domestic profit. I mean, that's just a mind-boggling figure. And it's about 3 times the profit as a proportion of GDP compared with the banks in the United Kingdom and in the United States. I mean, this is unfathomable. And then what's happened in the last few weeks? Banks have started jacking up home mortgage rates. What, isn't $30 billion enough profit? Have they got to go after and not just investors, Speaker, go after owner-occupiers and say, look, sorry, Mr and Mrs, whoever, I won't say Mr and Mrs Smith, but, someone, we're not making enough profit. $30,000 million, we're on our arse here. We need more money, so we're going to jack up the interest rate on your owner-occupier loan. I mean, this is unconscionable behaviour. Is the government doing anything about it, Speaker? No. The government's refusal to have a royal commission into the conduct of the banks is unconscionable. I applaud. Although the Labor Party had no interest in a mandatory code of conduct 5 years ago, at least the Labor Party is red hot on the issue of a royal commission, and I applaud it. It is simply not good enough for the Prime Minister to have stood up last year and say, well, we'll pull the bank leaders in before the House of Representatives Economics Committee, and they can explain themselves once every year or so. Simply not good enough. And then the government wants to give the banks a $7 billion tax cut. So not only are the banks making $30 billion a year, not only are they jacking up owner-occupier interest rates on mum and dad and their families, the government wants to give them another $7,000 million profit. I mean, what's going on with the government? Totally beholden to the banking industry. Totally beholden to the banking industry. Well, Speaker, today is an opportunity for the government, supported by the opposition and my crossbench colleagues, which seems to be growing at the moment. I'm delighted with that. This is the opportunity for we in this place to show that we care about the community, we are concerned about the conduct of the banks, and if nothing else, we'll turn an ineffective bank-run voluntary code of conduct into a legislated mandatory code of conduct where the minister has power, where APRA has punitive powers, and we can finally rein in the power of the banks. Thank you, Speaker.
Thank the member for Denison.